pleasure to hand over to the chair of the session, the chair of the Fabian Women's Network, Sarah Hyde.
Good morning. Thank you, Andy, and thank you to all of you for joining us on this Sunday morning. I hope you're caffeinated, feeling full of beans and ready to go after a really inspiring day yesterday. And it's our absolute pleasure to be hosting the Shadow Home Secretary this morning, Nick Thomas-Symonds, for this session. And you probably know about Nick. He's been obviously in position since April last year, having become the MP for Torvine in 2015. Prior to that, he was a barrister and had written acclaimed biographies of both Clement Attlee and Nye Bevan. So thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to hear from you. Audience, please do remember to tweet, put your questions in the Q&A box, because we're going to be having the keynote speech, and then we'll be bringing people in to ask questions. We're going to see how the tech goes. We might be bringing you in person, or we may just be clustering the questions for me to ask if there's not too much of a delay. But without further ado, welcome to you, Nick. Thanks for joining us on your Sunday morning, and we're going to hand over to you for this keynote speech.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, to Andrew, and thank you, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. And friends, it really is a great honour to be able to speak to you all today. And the Fabian Society, from its origins in the 1880s to its role as a founding organisation of the Labour Representation Committee in 1900, has facilitated important debates that have changed the course of our party and indeed our country. And I'm very proud to be a Fabian, and I know that for so many of us in the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement, the idea of coming together to discuss ideas and inspire one another is such a core part of our politics, and indeed a core part of our lives. I think we're all missing that at the moment. It's why coming together in this virtual way is so important. But I know everybody is missing the usual party events that we would attend, the discussions with family and friends over the dinner table. And I think I've even got to the stage where I would take some of the worst doorstep rants that I've endured over the isolation that we face. So it is today that is so important, this event that's so important. I want to thank everyone at the Fabian Society involved in putting this together, because I know how difficult it has been, and the dedication and perseverance to make this possible has been outstanding. And I want to thank everybody today for attending. And I know you will be doing it in the spirit of hope and optimism, and in the knowledge that through our combined efforts, we can build a better tomorrow, even in the face of the huge challenges of this pandemic. So today I want to speak about the work we are doing in the Shadow Cabinet and the Shadow Home Office team in particular to provide effective opposition throughout this crisis, and to develop that vision for the Labour approach to home affairs that rebuilds trust in Labour to keep you, your family and your community safe. But firstly, I want to set that work in the context of my own great passion, which is that of Labour history. As Sarah mentioned, I am deeply proud to be a biographer of Clement Attlee and Nye Bevan. And growing up in a working class mining valley next door to Nye Bevan's constituency, I've always taken great inspiration from this towering figure in our movement. And like all of us, my politics is indelibly shaped by the colossal achievements of that 1945 Attlee government. I spent years of my life writing about that period, and it feels like the perfect primer for the world that we are now in. The challenges they faced emerging from the Second World War could not have been more stark. A nation, both literally and figuratively, in need of rebuilding, facing staggering debt, a social safety net not able to deal with the needs of the day. Yet in the face of that, Labour's vision was as bold as it was necessary, for a more equal society where everyone could live a fulfilled life from beginning to end, with decent pensions and decent homes for all, support for people who were sick, and keeping people in work. This was aptly summed up in the title of our 1945 manifesto, Let Us Face the Future. And when the country turned to Labour, with its promise of a better world, it delivered changes and institutions that today define our country. Chief amongst them, of course, was the National Health Service. Never more loved, never more necessary than it is today. And Labour was able to rise to the challenges of that post-war period, not in spite of our values, but because of our values. These were values forged in the Labour movement and in tune with the concerns of the British public. As Aneurin Bevan said, the language of priorities is the religion of socialism. The argument is about power, because only by the possession of power can you get the priorities correct. And that challenge now passes to our generation of this great movement. We have a responsibility in moments of crisis like this one. People rely on us. They look to Labour to offer direction and moral leadership. These moments of crisis shine a penetrating light on how the world has been, how we live today, and what our futures could hold. That is why these moments can be such catalysts for change. One thing is certainly for sure. The Tory party left this country poorly prepared going into the crisis. They've handled the pandemic badly, and they certainly can't be trusted to rebuild. And on that point, I'm reminded of another of my favourite Aneurin Bevan quotes. With a touch of sarcasm, discussing typical Tory mismanagement, he said, "This island is made mainly of coal and surrounded by fish. Only an organising genius could produce a shortage of coal and fish at the same time. And doesn't that remind you of this shower of a government we have in power today?" With the resources of this brilliant, remarkable country at their disposal, we are suffering with increasingly high death toll and severe economic impact. And let us remember every single one of those lives lost to this awful virus and all those families for whom life will never be the same again. In my role shadowing the Home Secretary, I get to see this incompetence close up. Priti Patel promised to terrify criminals. Instead, she's ultimately responsible for letting them walk free. We saw this week the startling news of 150,000 police records having been deleted from the police national computer. As the picture emerged more fully, it was calculated the number had risen to over 400,000 deletions, a staggering number. Firstly, the policing minister said this wasn't data from convicted criminals, yet that was contradicted within a matter of hours. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, given his own admission that he found out about this massive crisis from Twitter. This is an extraordinarily serious security breach that presents huge dangers for public safety. Losing DNA, fingerprints, and arrest records will mean criminals escape punishment, victims will lose access to justice, and communities more dangerous. Yet on an issue of such magnitude, the Home Secretary has shown no leadership. Instead, she is hiding away from scrutiny. The truth is, this Home Secretary is quick to try to talk tough, but when the going gets tough, she's nowhere to be seen. And on top of that crisis, in this week alone, the government has been forced to delay requirements for travellers to have a negative COVID test because the government and the Home Office couldn't get the systems in place in time. At the same time, just 3% of those who arrive in the UK are being tracked by the quarantining system. Little wonder, sadly, that the virus strains that emerged in Brazil and in South Africa have been found in the country. Instead of having a strategy, the government is lurching from one crisis to another, reacting after events and putting the public at risk. These are chronic, systemic failures across the board. The scale of the incompetence of Priti Patel and the Conservative government is putting national security at risk. And part of the reason for this is rather than focusing on the job at hand, all too often their so-called leadership is either looking for tomorrow's headlines or looking over their shoulders at their backbenches. But with the vaccine beginning to roll out, there is hope, there is light ahead. And I have nothing but thanks and admiration for the British scientists and the NHS who are making this hope possible. I'm also proud that the Labour Party, the trade unions, and indeed the Mirror newspaper have come together to help mobilise our collective strength to help with this rollout through the Let's Vaccinate Britain campaign. And believe me, that is a powerful movement. Our workers united can help us defeat this virus. And that is the spirit of unity and of common purpose that I want to continue to harness as we seek to gain the public's trust in Labour to rebuild out of this crisis. And I know that people will only trust Labour with that job if they trust us to keep the things they care about safe. It's a solemn part of the contract we seek to build. But let me be clear, the way to do that is never to copy the divisive and hateful politics of those we seek to replace. And I take my inspiration from an Aneurin Bevan. And Aneurin Bevan said, not even the apparently enlightened principle of the greatest good for the greatest number can excuse indifference to individual suffering. There is no test for progress other than its impact on the individual. And that's the principle I draw on every day when I judge government policy, when I judge our policy. Nobody should be left behind. We will always support the most vulnerable. We will always stand beside victims. And to do that, we need an approach that prevents crime and catches criminals, compassion and competence. And in my work, shadowing the Home Secretary, I see the impact of their lack of compassion and indeed their lack of competence on a daily basis. Sorry. Their lack of competence and their lack of compassion has meant that violent crime is up 150% in a decade. Domestic abuse services struggling to keep the doors open. A Windrush compensation so mean and so badly handled that it is heaping insult on top of injustice. And an attitude to immigration that will starve our NHS workers. We need our NHS of the workers we need to save lives, and would rather see children abandoned in a burning refugee camp than actually live up to our promises. We stand beside victims. We put victims first. The Tories are letting down victims. But is it any wonder that the direction of all of this was set by a Home Secretary who broke the ministerial code through bullying? And what does it say when the PM's advisor on ethics loses their job over that fiasco and not the Home Secretary? It's one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. I'm clear that with me as Shadow Home Secretary, we will expose this rotten government. And we are achieving successes too. Securing £76 million in emergency funding for domestic abuse services in lockdown. Working with people across the Labour movement to secure concessions in the domestic abuse bill. Improving housing access for domestic abuse victims. Stopping perpetrators using the courts to continue their abuse. And abolishing the awful so-called rough sex defence that allowed people to escape punishment for awful sexual violence. Winning a U-turn on the shameful NHS immigration surcharge for health and care workers. As we clapped on a Thursday, the government was carrying on charging our overseas workers for using the very services they were maintaining and keeping in place for other people. We have also stood with our brave frontline emergency service workers throughout this crisis. And I want to thank our frontline police officers and our firefighters. It's been an inspiration to meet with those on the front line who steadfastly put themselves in harm's way to keep us safe throughout the crisis. They have been there for us, and a pay freeze is unforgivable. We also know how dangerously stretched these services are following a decade of austerity, and we must argue to prevent the same damage being repeated again. But I'm clear that it is only through being trusted on policing that we can be trusted to bring about the reforms necessary. Part of my job is to rebuild that trust, and it's one I take incredibly seriously. In the Labour Party, we know our emergency services belong to all our communities. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement has been a powerful, extraordinary movement for change. And we must listen to those voices in our Black communities who have expressed how deep-rooted the systemic racism is in our society and why so much more remains to be done. These words must be met by deeds. Yet with this government, action never comes. As Home Secretary, I would lead the change that is necessary from the top. I don't need yet more reviews to set out the issues with structural racism. What we need is action, and I, as Home Secretary, will act. A Windrush compensation worthy of the name. Diversity in police recruitment and training, so our forces look more like the communities they serve. Implementing the review of David Lammy, my good friend, with action on deaths in police custody. And I'm proud too to be part of a Labour shadow cabinet committed to a new Race Relations Act that will be about addressing structural racial inequality at source. But we also know that on many fronts, the Tories will try to use the pandemic to push through reforms that will damage the UK in so many ways. Take immigration. Their new system judges people on the money they make, not the service and skills they provide. We know that people are not paid the value of what they contribute to our society. Even after this awful pandemic, they still think the care workers are unskilled. But in Labour, we have always known they are the true heroes and heroines of our society. On security, Priti Patel talks tough, but the Tories have made promises on security they are struggling to keep. Now the pressure is on to show that they can ensure we have the tools required to replace those lost when we left the transition period after our exit from the European Union. But it's not just enough to point out the failings of this rotten government. We also have to show how Labour will be better, how we will make concrete changes to improve people's lives. And I take the example from Labour history of Barbara Castle, a shining example of how someone who put Labour values into practice. Whether it was advancing equal pay, saving lives through public safety legislation, or drive forward campaigning to tackle global poverty. Or the last Labour government, the minimum wage, record investment in public services, and record decreases in crime. Every Tory government leaves the country in a worse place than they found it. Every Labour government has the lot of improving it. We will do it again. And I promise that under Keir Starmer's leadership, we will always be a party that puts people's interest and the national interest first. It's why I'm looking forward to campaigning with Labour councils and police and crime commissioners across the country in the run-up to May's elections. Our people are making a huge difference to our front line. Funding domestic abuse services, paying for youth clubs the Tories have slashed, welcoming refugees who are escaping unimaginable hardships. And that's an example of what we can achieve in power. And it's all of our role now to do what we can to return as many police commissioners as we can in those elections in May. And those elections in May are a vital step on the long and difficult road back to power for Labour. But if we are in need of inspiration, we don't have far to look. We can look around us at every community in our country, pulling together to overcome this awful virus. The biggest of challenges exposes character. And in the face of this crisis, the British people have been inspirational. So I want to work with all of you and across our movement to harness that power, that optimism, that selflessness to shape a vision for the next transformative Labour government. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. And normally, if we were all together in real life, rapturous applause would have exploded all around.
And sorry for the little dash in the middle of the speech. I had to rescue my technology from collapsing down, but I did manage to rescue it. So thank you.
I assumed it was something important like a cat, a child, or technology. That's normally
technology. Otherwise, my laptop would have disappeared, but I saved it. So thank you, everybody.
Good. I'm sincerely glad, because that was an excellent speech and it was wonderful to hear it in its entirety without being stymied by collapsing laptops. So thank you so much for setting out that very clear, purposeful vision across your very, very wide-ranging brief. As I was preparing for this, Nick, I did think, my goodness, particularly in this area, where do you start with the failures of this government? You know, there's so many things we could discuss in greater depth now, because the level of crisis across the immigration system, the management of the COVID response, the increase in violence against women and girls during the pandemic, the appalling failure to really do a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And now we hear Jenrick is tinkering around the edges, worrying about baying mobs and town hall militants rather than actually producing a proper strategy for dealing with racial inequality and structural racism in this country. So thank you for addressing so many of those key points in that pithy and really helpful speech. And thank you for highlighting so much of our roots and our history, and that incredible quote about not being indifferent to the suffering of the individual, which obviously when we look at things like the immigration system and people's refugees coming to this country is so apparent and so obvious. We obviously are needing to increase the trust of the public, to reassure the British public that the Labour Party can be trusted with their safety, their security, for safer communities. And I wondered if you had thoughts on how we go about that without betraying our core Labour values.
I think that's a really good question, and far from betraying our core values, I think that our approach to crime is actually putting our values into action. Now, we need to do, I think, two things to do that. And our approach will always be different from the Conservatives. We need to both prevent people from committing crime in the first place, and we also need to ensure that we do have the police on our streets to ensure that criminals are caught and actually are held to account and face justice for what they do. And let's just contrast the two approaches here. Our approach is about compassion and competence. It's about putting victims first. It is absolutely core to our values that we stand with vulnerable people. We stand with victims across our country. That's what we've been doing so successfully with what we've been trying to do with domestic abuse and pressing the government throughout the pandemic. Now, on the crime prevention side, there's some excellent work going on already by Labour in power through our police and crime commissioners. I visited West Midlands across the summer, saw the work that David Jameson is doing there in Coventry in terms of support for communities. Contrast that with the Conservatives. Mental health support slashed, youth services slashed, support for children excluded from school slashed. It is no surprise that that leads to an increase in crime. Falling police numbers, which it took years for the Tory Home Secretaries to even accept that those falling police numbers were contributing to rising crime. In contrast, Labour knows that investing in policing, which the last Labour government did over a 13-year period, is important. And remember too, that even if the Tories successfully recruit 20,000 officers, they will still be beneath the number of officers that the last Labour government left in 2010. So we will put victims first. That's our Labour value in action, of standing with the most vulnerable, exactly as Aneurin Bevan says in that quotation, not excusing individual suffering or being indifferent to it, but ensuring that we have that approach of both preventing crime and ensure criminals are caught that I believe will actually be a plan that will reduce crime, not the chronic failure we see from the Conservatives.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear that comprehensive, social justice-hearted response to that. Of course, many of the people, particularly young people and women that are caught up in the criminal justice system, have been victims of crime first. So it's a complex issue, and one that we need to have that boldness on that you spoke about at the beginning. On to another topic. There's huge failings at the moment in the national referral mechanism for victims of trafficking. I know that's something we didn't pick up on, and it's partly, I think, in the light of COVID and Brexit and all of the other pressures, and this really crucial element that affects millions of people across the globe. So in some way it is Lisa's brief, but in many ways yours. We're really failing people. The national referral mechanism, people are meant to be referred into that in 30 days, and the current average is 450 days. And some people are waiting thousands of victims are waiting several years to get the help that they need, whilst being in very uncertain status. And again, I just wonder if you had any comments on the suffering of those particular individuals, and what a kind of Labour response to modern day slavery and human trafficking would look like.
Yeah, and let's just return really to the central failures of this Conservative government: compassion and competence. And you see it, I'm afraid, in their approach to trafficking, to human slavery trafficking, exactly. Incompetent and indeed lacking compassion for the victims. And I think, Sarah, I think you quoted then the statistics yourself about the national referral mechanism. To have, referral period of well over 400 days, 450 and something, I mean, that is absolutely shocking. That is shocking. It is ineptitude of the highest order, and it is ineptitude that is causing suffering on a day-to-day basis. Now, what we need to do in terms of trafficking and human slavery is, firstly, we need to be having that leadership from the very top of the Home Office, that this is a top priority, that we understand the suffering to individuals that this causes. We need to be working internationally. We need to be showing the world a gold standard internationally of how we actually deal with this problem. And I know Lisa, Nandi, who I know you've heard from already, feels very passionately about this as well. We would actually be projecting Labour values around the world and wanting to show to the world, we want to work with you to show the very best practices, the very best focus to tackling this fundamental issue. But to tackle it, you need those two things. You need, first of all, compassion, a care for the victims. And if you had that compassion and care for the victims in practice, you wouldn't be leaving it hundreds of days for the national referral mechanism to actually operate. You would be focusing on it, providing that leadership from the very top competently to be able to deal with it. What better illustration could you have of a need, a desperate need for Labour values, than to actually focus on that issue and make a difference?
Yeah, thank you. And that's great to hear your passion for that particular subject. It's a great passion of mine. We're going to give the opportunity now for some of our attendees to come in. There's been some absolutely excellent questions across the whole of your brief. You'll be pleased to know coming in. We're going to give this a go of bringing the individual speakers in, and let's see how we get on. So I'd love to bring Rosalind Garton and Dee Dutter in, please, if that's possible. Katie Curtis, the genius on the back end of this whole extravaganza. There's always a gentle pause while we await the arrival of the questioner.
I'm very impressed by the technology, Sarah.
So far, it's like, oh, look at this, beautiful, wonderful. Hello, Rosalind. Please go ahead with your question.
The thing that struck me, Nick, about this latest story about the loss of police data, and I'm sure we're all feeling the same, is in this day and age, a lack of a backup. If you had overall responsibility as Home Secretary for the police service, a police service which clearly has a deficiency in data backup systems, would you consider it appropriate that you resign after the loss of that data?
Thank you so much, Rosalind. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Dee Dutter, if I may, and then ask Nick to answer both questions at the same time. Thank you so much.
Nick, you've obviously quite rightly identified that Priti Patel is busy chasing headlines rather than doing her job. Is it time for us to, I'm a counterterrorism researcher, is it time for us to update the prevent counterterrorism legislation introduced by the Tories in a future Labour government. Even the Met's head of counterterrorism thinks that this legislation is not fit for purpose.
Dr. Durr, I didn't catch the first part of your question. I wonder if you just repeat the first part of your question. I caught the bit about the legislation not being fit for purpose, but I didn't catch the first part.
Is it time to update the prevent counterterrorism legislation?
Oh, prevent counterterrorism. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, fine.
Great. Thank you so much for those excellent questions. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, well, Rosalind, a cabinet minister who actually took responsibility for their own department would be a novelty in this government, I'm sad to say. There was a time when ministers did take responsibility, and of course I would take responsibility as the Home Secretary for what happens in the department, and my responsibility to put it right. The mention of a lack of a backup, actually, both the Police National Computer and the Police National Database are due to be replaced by a new national law enforcement database. However, if you look at the current assessment as to when that's going to be brought into effect, it's been assessed to be in the amber red category. In other words, it is at present doubtful that that database will actually be delivered on time. Now, number one, why is it like that? The Tories have been in power for coming up to 11 years. Why is the replacement for the Police National Database and Police National Computer so far behind? Why haven't they focused on it to actually bring it into being? And that database would then have that far greater protection that we actually need. But the question for now is, what's gone wrong? What's the situation, as you quite rightly say, with this data being backed up and where it can be recovered from? And thirdly, what processes are going to be put in place to actually prevent this from happening again? But far from having a Home Secretary that takes responsibility, the Home Secretary hasn't even appeared in public since this crisis broke on Thursday night. Indeed, we had to learn about it from the newspapers rather than learn from it actually from her and what she was going to do about it. Ministers in this government, I'm afraid, just don't take responsibility. There's a culture of not taking responsibility, and it is corrosive, frankly, to the quality of governance right across the cabinet. Secondly, on the issue of prevent, it was me in my previous role that actually secured the review of prevent. It hasn't actually begun yet, and I will be pushing for it to begin. But look, I think on the principle, as I've already spoken about, of preventing people falling into a life of crime, I think everyone on this call would absolutely agree that's what we need to do. But there is no doubt either that there are communities who have undoubtedly lost faith in the programme, the prevent programme as it is. That's why, I was calling for that review. I've been calling for it for a number of years. It is there. It needs to happen. And my concern about prevent in recent years has been that I think it has mixed up different aims. It's mixed up things like community cohesion being pressed into it that shouldn't be in it. And I think what we now need to do is we need to see that review. It needs to be independent. It needs to be properly robust. And we also, frankly, need more widely to be looking at the issue of crime prevention, investing in the services that everybody across this call knows would make a huge difference to people not falling into a life of crime.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to bring in questions now from Martin Ricks and Joanna Paish, I believe. And apologies for the noises off from some toddlers downstairs.
Mine are upstairs at the moment, so.
See which ones are louder. Martin, are you there? It was going so well. It was so smooth for the first two. Perhaps I'll ask one of the other questions maybe while we're waiting for a question to come in. Somebody's asked a question about the age of criminal responsibility in the UK. At 10, it's one of the lowest, certainly in Europe and I believe in the world. And I don't know if there's any thoughts or suggestions that we might have a look at that.
I just think we need to have a whole holistic look at, youth crime and youth justice. I mean, I was a barrister. I practiced in criminal law for, in the early part of my career. And I used to find that the youth court in particular was one of the very saddest things that I ever went to and I ever appeared in my daily work. And it seems to me there is a whole issue here around young people and around youth services. I think this government is desperately failing young people on so many different levels. I mean, firstly, you have the cuts to youth services, which are unquestionably having an impact as to people falling into a life of crime. But look at where we are at the moment. If you go to university, then look at the mess the Conservatives have made of the university experience and throughout this pandemic. If you are someone who doesn't go to university and takes a different route, nonetheless, you are going to go to a job market that is going to contain extraordinarily high levels of employment because of the Tory mismanagement of the economy, not just over the last 9 or 10 months, but frankly, over the last 11 years. So I think that youth justice and actually our policy towards young people is something we need to look at on a very wide basis.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Let's give that another go, bringing in Martin and Joanna. I can see Martin in the chat saying he's not sure why it won't turn on. So I'm just going to give that a moment. And if not, I'm afraid, Martin and Joanna, I'll be asking the questions for you if we can't see your lovely faces and hear from you direct. Just give that a moment. Okay, I think I'm going to ask Martin's question as he's got problems coming in, and maybe we can get Joanna in the time that I'm reading Martin's question, and if not, I'm afraid I'll have to read hers as well. Martin said, could Nick expand on what Labour's immigration system will look like? I'm particularly interested in what this will be for non-EU nationals. Will the NHS surcharge be abolished? What about the ridiculous life in the UK test? Will the Tories' point system be changed? Main thing for me is about having compassion at the centre of the system, remembering every applicant is a human being and not a number, which obviously resonates with many of the things you've already said. Any chance we're going to be able to bring Joanna in? Okay, Joanna, I'm going to go for it on your behalf, I'm afraid as well. So Joanna says, Nick, are you concerned about the effect of COVID and the lockdowns on the police and criminal justice system and the delayed outcomes for victims of crime and for people on remand? Very important. Does it make people who commit crime more confident that they can carry on without sanction?
Thank you. I'll take those questions just in reverse order. On the second question, you are absolutely right to be concerned about how the whole criminal justice system is working during the pandemic. And it is absolutely vital that it works. Obviously, it has to work in a safe way. Of course it does. But if it doesn't work efficiently, the people who lose out in the end will be the victims, if it doesn't work out in the way that it absolutely should. The Tories have shown very little focus on this. My colleague David Lammy has been exposing quite brilliantly the total failure of the Conservatives in terms of managing our prisons and indeed managing our court system to be efficient. And what we also have to remember here is this, that lockdowns do change patterns of crime. Unfortunately, as we've discovered, whilst of course the stay-at-home message, we absolutely back the stay-at-home message, that is necessary for public health. The home is not always a safe place for everybody.
Yeah.
And if you are a victim in a controlling relationship, unfortunately, you are creating conditions that allow that controlling behaviour to be increased and to continue to thrive. So there's been this, sadly, extraordinary spike in domestic abuse that we've seen through calls to national helplines. You know, I speak to the sector on a regular basis, and that they tell me that that is one of the saddest things they are seeing on a regular basis. So the lockdown does change patterns of crime, but what it also does, and we really have to remember this, that We are asking frontline police officers to enforce the public health measures that are being put forward. And there's quite rightly a lot of focus on that. But other crime is still going on. Emergency crime is still going on. So resources are massively under strain in order to ensure that people are properly protected and perpetrators, whether it's of abuse, violence and other types of crime, are actually brought to justice. And I think that the Tory approach, which has essentially been pretty chaotic, they haven't even got restrictions in place as clearly as they could be, is simply adding to that. And I think that that has meant that right through the criminal justice system, you have this problem, and it is unquestionably failing victims of crime. And we will continue, David Lammy and I will continue to hold the government to account on that. In terms of our immigration system, I hope I've given a sense in my speech of the values that inform my approach. And I think it was summed up there, if I may say so, in the question with the mention of compassion and individuals. These are individual people's lives. And of course, living, working in other countries as part of your family. This is part of Labour's DNA. This is part of the values that will underpin the proposals that we will put forward on immigration in 2024. And we opposed the immigration bill, and we opposed it because the bill isn't in the national interest. The bill seeks to value people by the amount that they earn. And if this crisis tells us one thing, it's that people's contribution to our society is not reflected in what they are paid. And what does the government now say? The very people who kept this country running are now being told they face a pay freeze. I think it's absolutely shameful that that is what the government is doing. And I just wanted to say a word, if I could, as well, about the Channel crossings over the summer, because if ever there was an example of Tory values and the wrong values, compassion and competence lacking, it was that. When the Tories should have been working at an earlier stage with the French authorities, they should have been reopening the legal routes, the safe and legal routes, and heeding the fact that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which, by the way, the current Home Secretary was a member of at the time, in 2019 had actually said that the Tory approach to immigration was going to lead to more people taking to the sea and these dangerous routes. And by the way, I've been talking about Labour history. It is, I'm afraid, a feature that Labour governments create overseas development, overseas aid departments. They focus on overseas aid. And I'm afraid the next Tory government always finds a way of abolishing the overseas aid department. What a short-sighted thing to do. If you wanted to ask the question, why is it that people are being displaced around the world? It's because of war, poverty, persecution. The one government department that was focused on trying to deal with those issues, the Tories decide to abolish. Lacking compassion, lacking competence, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. And in this post-Brexit, incoming Biden era, those international socialist principles are going to be needed, I think, more than ever to rebuild from Trump and to help the UK thrive and go forward without, at the moment, without being part of the EU. So thank you for highlighting that. And thank you also for touching on those really heartbreaking scenes that we see predominantly in the summer, but now that are happening year round, with people trying to come to this country through unsafe means, because those root causes where the Tories have absolutely failed to invest in the way that they should, and outlining how we would be different. Thank you. I also just wanted to come back to the point about the justice system being affected by COVID. It's been in the news this morning that 1 in 10 prison officers are isolating. And I know that Twitter and through personal connections that many of the court staff feel deeply unsafe. Courts are still sitting face to face, not virtually. There's a lack of cleaning. There's people being put in a perspex dock. We know now about aerosol transmission, and that there's court staff, there's witnesses, and perpetrators and the whole machinery. Is a very high risk scenario, and yet at the same time we see the need for justice systems to continue and function during this pandemic time. And I just didn't know if from you or your kind of wider Home Affairs team, your work with Charlie Faulkner, whether we had any challenges for the government, suggestions of what we could be doing differently to ensure justice is not denied at this time, but our courts function safely for all of those people having to use them.
Well, as you know, David Lammy has called for two what I regard to be, really important things. He called for openness and transparency on the evidence of actually running our courts, so we can look at it and look at alternatives. But secondly, we've called for the idea of Nightingale courts throughout the pandemic. We've been calling for, we obviously had the Nightingale hospitals, which, great credit to all those who are involved in building those. We've called for a similar approach to courts, and we called for that approach, by the way, in advance of what happened over the last few months, because in the first lockdown last spring, and indeed through the summer, it was almost as if the Tories didn't want to talk about prisons. They didn't want to talk about the dangers that, the virus spreading within prisons actually posed to people. And it's not just it's about people within the prison, people who work in the prison, people outside the prison, in the local areas, all these things. And we've been pushing on that throughout the last 9 or 10 months. David has been pressing on both those things throughout. Had they listened, they might have found they're not in the position that they're currently in. But what they're actually trying to do is using existing court facilities. And I know the existing court facilities very well. Doesn't help either, by the way, the number of courts that they've closed over the past 11 years, which means that there's far fewer premises available than otherwise there would have been, which would, of course, have been made the current situation a lot easier.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to have another go at bringing in a live question from the audience. We're going to go to Alice Mapofu-Coles. She is a Fabian Women's Network sister. I know Alice, she's excellent. She's standing to be a council candidate also in May, and she's on our mentoring scheme this year. She's asked a brilliant question, so I'm hoping we can hear from her directly. So let's just give the technology a moment to work, and then I'll group that together with some of the questions that have been submitted anonymously, and I'll ask those because obviously the questioners don't wish to be identified. So let's just see if we can bring Alice in here. Give it another 10 seconds. Oh, yes, here we go. Hi, Alice, we can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, go for it.
Okay, I'm not sure how to put the camera on, but at least you can hear me. I just wanted to ask Nick, that was a great speech. I waited yesterday to hear something like this, and this is very moving. I'm a refugee myself, and I work with a lot of refugee organizations. What I wanted to find from you was that what lessons have you, as currently a shadow minister have you learned from what has happened within the refugee community, discrimination, Black Lives Matter, and incarceration of young youth people, because it has been a moment of reflection for the past year that there are some things that we should carry on as Labour and see how we implement that, because many Black people feel that they don't have a voice in how policies are done or influence any laws in the UK.
I couldn't quite catch that, Sarah. You couldn't just repeat it, please?
Can you just repeat the question?
I can't quite hear you now, Sarah. You couldn't just put the issue in the chat for me, and then.
Sure. Okay. What I'll do, actually, I've just got another question up, and then I will put Alice's question in the chat for you also. So
Sorry, Alice. I couldn't hear on the sound, and then I can answer from the chat.
That's all right.
So the other question I was going to pair that with is, how will Labour reduce race disparity in the criminal justice system, and in particular police powers, which are disproportionately used on Black people? How will Labour improve trust and confidence in policing in Black Asian and minority ethnic communities, which is creating a wall of silence for the police trying to solve crimes and making recruiting a diverse police force more difficult. And then let me just see if I can find Alice's question in amongst these. Yeah. So Alice's question was, what are the lessons Labour can learn from the refugee discrimination, Black Lives Matter, and that Black people in the UK, especially in Labour, have no voice or influencing politics, which includes the overrepresentation of young Black men in the incarcerated population?
Extraordinarily important question, Alice, and really grateful to you for raising that. And I'm sorry I couldn't hear because of the sound then. That's extraordinarily important. I think first and foremost, what I would want to say about this is that I don't believe we are in a position where we need yet more reviews about this. If you look at, take the deaths in police custody example, which again is wholly disproportionate if you look at the statistics. Angiolini review took place in 2017 about that. There were 101 recommendations. We're coming up to 4 years now since that review. Number implemented by the Conservatives, 0. There is a ready-made set of recommendations.
Yeah.
David Lammy's review that I've mentioned a couple of times already, he published that in September 2017. It's got 35 recommendations in it, including what I think is a really important recommendation of where you try to follow cases right through the criminal justice system, but you essentially look at them almost anonymized. You look at them and see what the outcome is if there were no characteristics in the case. A really powerful proposal to look at how you can start to bring about change. But in terms of policing specifically, and I do commend as well the work that Sadiq Khan is doing, his trust and confidence plan as Mayor of London, very important. I'll come back to why that is in a moment. But we all know the disproportionality exists. Right? We know that. The statistics all tell us that. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And it's also important that every community has trust and confidence in policing. I think the issues are about training. It's about professionalism in terms of stop and search, evidence-based, intelligence-led stop and search that's carried out in a professional way. But it is also, in my view, and I've seen this over the past 9 or 10 months, about trust and confidence in the complaints process that exists as well. So it's that first bit about change, police forces looking like the communities they represent, that would be a reform clearly that the next Labour government is going to want to put into action. But it is also about that complaints process and people feeling, exactly as you said in your question, that their voice is heard. There's work going on at the moment with Sadiq Khan, looking at how that can be made more transparent, more responsive, so that when people do raise issues, that they are very, very quickly dealt with. So working closely with the Mayor of London on that, but be in no doubt that I am fully aware and feel very deeply the inequality, the disproportionality that exists. What I want to do is to actually put into place the measures that have already been identified that should be put into place, not just conduct more and more reviews, which, to be frank, are being used as a substitute for action by the government.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to just ask a few questions to you directly, Nick. We're just in the closing minutes here. So the answers are insightful and excellent, but we're going to go for brief, pithy answers to get through a couple more questions here. Firstly, how would you, from Anonymous, how would you reconcile Labour's core progressive values around social liberalism with winning back lost voters for whom such issues may not be a priority? And then a question about these really important Police and Crime Commissioner elections in May. Which do you consider are the key battlegrounds? And finally, just a quick question on Labour's policy around county lines, whether that should be classed as trafficking and what we do, because that is another one of those crimes that has really increased during lockdown, the coercion and abuse of children trafficking drugs around the country. Thanks.
Right, very quickly in a few minutes. On the first question, I don't believe there is a conflict. I believe you can go to any constituency around the country. They all want to see lower crime levels. And that lower crime level is brought about both by preventing crime and by ensuring that people face justice for what they've actually done. I don't believe that our progressive value, and our progressive value is about standing beside victims, is different in any different part of the country. And all 43 police force areas of England and Wales sadly have rising violent crime. I don't think you'll find anyone in any of those who says we don't need lower violent crime. It's just our approach of doing it is a workable solution, not the Tory tough rhetoric that goes nowhere. Secondly, in terms of the PCC elections, we are putting together, I'm working very closely with Labour HQ in terms of assessing, first of all, keeping what we've got. They've then got an actual list that they've set out of our target seats, which we'll obviously be then identifying for resources over the next few months. And thirdly, just on the issue of county lines is a hugely increasing problem.
Yeah.
You know, we talked a little while ago about children, and this. We really are blurring the lines here between victims and criminals, really blurring the lines, because the children who are actually being used in a lot of cases to transport these drugs are actually victims themselves. They are being exploited awfully by the people that we really need to be arresting, who are running these county lines gangs, who are exploiting many, many people. And again, with county lines gangs, we come back to the central Tory problem. You listen to the Tories, they'll talk tough about county lines. They say they're doing something about it.
Yeah.
Yet the problem is a growing problem where we both need to be putting the resources in to actually tackle it, but doing everything we can to prevent people becoming involved in these gangs in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick, for that wide-ranging discussion. I could be here all day, but apparently there are other sessions. Apparently there's a whole program. And in a moment, there's the opportunity to join 3 different breakout sessions. The information is in the chat box or in the program. But I just really want to thank you, Nick, for, as you say, setting out a bold vision, that more equal society where everybody can lead a decent life. And what an incredible vision. And we're obviously working at all the detail of what that means, how we're going to get there. Some very clearly on the front foot for those police and crime commissioner elections in May, some a bit kind of further reaching vision to the next general election. But it has been an absolute pleasure to spend part of our Sunday morning with you, hearing about your passion and commitment to that vision. Thank you so much.